In this lesson, we are going to begin our discussion of the history of Christianity. The goal in this short video is to tackle and answer the following question: what do we know about the life of Jesus? Now, this is really going to be the first question that we're going to answer in our discussion of the history of Christianity, but a necessary first step in order to understand later and future developments. First and foremost, as we talk about the life of Jesus, and in a minute we're going to begin to talk about some of the most important events, one of the first and most important aspects in all of this is that when we understand the history of Christianity and the way that historians understand Christianity, is that the majority of scholars accept that Jesus existed. Jesus was a historical figure. And what we will discuss in future lessons are the differences between the way that historians understand historical Jesus and the ways in which Christians, as a matter of faith, understands Jesus. Before we get to the narrative, we have to understand one other question, and this is something that we're going to return to in future lessons, but we're just going to mention it now. How do we know about Jesus? What are the sources? The major source of the life of Jesus is what is called the gospel. The gospel is an account describing the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Now, if you don't know what that means and you don't understand that in its entirety, that's fine. We're going to come back to that and in future lessons. But what we're about to discuss comes from the different gospel accounts of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. Now, again, just to give you a little bit of detail, there are, in effect, four gospel accounts. There's the gospel according to Mark, there's the gospel according to Matthew, there's the gospel according to Luke, and the gospel according to John. The gospels according to Mark, Matthew, and Luke are what are called the synoptic gospels, because Mark, Matthew, and Luke all give a synopsis or a summary of basically the same events. The book of John, while it is considered a gospel, is not considered a synoptic gospel because it gives different events in different details. Again, we're going to talk more about this in detail over the coming lessons, but I wanted to give you a sense of exactly where we're getting this information from. So again, we're getting this information from the Gospels. And again, a gospel is an account describing the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And from what we're going to learn right now comes from largely the books of Mark, Matthew, and Luke. Okay, so the origin of Christianity, the story of Jesus. And we're going to talk a little bit about the major events in the history of Jesus according to the three synoptic gospels. We're not going to talk about every single event, nor are we going to talk about all of the details of every single event, but rather we're going to talk about and mention some of the major details of Jesus' life. And the first account and the first major aspect we're going to talk about is what's called the Annunciation. The Annunciation is the announcement by the angel Gabriel to Mary, the mother of Jesus, that she's going to conceive and she's going to become the mother of Jesus, who is the Son of God. Gabriel, in fact, tells Mary what's to name Jesus. That's the Annunciation. Secondly, the birth of Jesus itself. According to the gospel accounts, and the gospels do differ in their accounts a little bit, but Jesus is born in the city of Bethlehem to Mary. According to one of the gospel accounts, Mary and her husband Joseph, the father of Jesus, have to travel from Nazareth to Bethlehem in order to find a place to give birth. But the birth of Jesus, generally considered and accepted by Christians to take place on the 25th of December, Christmas, is, according to the gospel accounts, one of the major holidays and one of the major moments of memorialization in the Christian calendar. The next event is what is called the Adoration of the Magi. The Adoration of the Magi is a name that is given to an instance in which the three magi, in most cases the term magi means kings, the three magi, following what they heard and following what is described as a star, come to travel to meet Jesus, to meet him, and to give him gifts. Because according to the gospel accounts, the three magi understand that Jesus is going to be some sort of God. He's going to be some sort of important figure. And these three magi, these three kings, try to find Jesus and try and give him gifts in celebration of his birth. The next major event is the slaughter of the innocents. In a very similar way to the Bible, to what is found in Sefer Shemot, the massacre of the innocents is the narrative in which the king, who, according to the gospel accounts, is Herod. Remember we discussed Herod. Herod orders all the execution of all of the young male children in the vicinity, in the area around Bethlehem. According to the gospel accounts, Herod had learned that a newborn child to the Jews, is going to rise up and is going to take over Herod, and Herod becomes scared. Herod becomes nervous that he's about to lose his throne, he's about to lose his power. And much like Paro in Sefer Shemot, Herod has many of the newborn sons killed in anticipation of one of them taking power and overthrowing him. In response to Herod's order to kill the young children, Mary, with Jesus, flees to Egypt. And the flight to Egypt, according to the gospel accounts, is Mary and Jesus escaping from the harsh decree of King Herod. Now, the next major event is an event that we're going to come back to as we talk about the historical Jesus, and that is the baptism of Jesus. The baptism of Jesus is where Jesus is really the beginning of Jesus's public career, where Jesus is anointed with holy water by an individual named John the Baptist. He goes through a purification ceremony by John the Baptist. Now, as we'll talk about, baptism is nothing new to Jesus, and in fact has its origins within Judaism itself. Many historians, again, take baptism as one of the historically verifiable moments in Jesus' life and marks the beginning of his public preaching career. The next major event, the next couple of events, are part of the public life of Jesus. Jesus is an adult. Jesus is beginning to travel around the land of Israel and beginning to have followers. And the first major series of teachings of Jesus are what are called the Sermon on the Mount. So we're going to come back to the Sermon on the Mount in class, but the Sermon on the Mount is the first major series of teachings of Jesus. Some of the major aspects of Christianity come out of the Sermon on the Mount, specifically the Beatitudes, which we'll discuss in class, as well as one of the first, if not the first, Christian prayer is included in the Sermon on the Mount, or based on the Sermon on the Mount, and that is the Lord's Prayer. We'll come back to the Lord's Prayer, and we'll come back to the Sermon on the Mount in class. But the Sermon on the Mount is really the first time in which Jesus publicly teaches, and which he begins to have a following. The next major event is really the first miracle that Jesus performs, and that is the marriage at Cana. At the marriage at Cana, according to the gospel accounts, Jesus is said to have performed his first miracle, turning water into wine. Another one of the miracles of the New Testament that is associated with Jesus is the raising of Lazarus. Again, according to the different gospel accounts, this is a miracle in which Jesus brings the individual named Lazarus back to life 4 days after his burial. This is one of the major miracles, obviously, associated with Jesus. And again, it's used to describe and to give testimony to his existence as not just a teacher, but as a holy person. There are many other miracles associated with Jesus. We're not going to mention all of them, but rather we're going to begin to talk about the end of his life, beginning with his arrival in Jerusalem, which is the account, again, an account in all four of the Gospels, where Jesus returns or comes to the city of Jerusalem in the final days of his life before his crucifixion. And as part of the arrival in Jerusalem, Jesus engages in what is called fighting the money changers. The narrative tells of Jesus coming to the city of Jerusalem around the time of Passover, like many Jews coming for the Passover holiday. And Jesus expels the money changers from the temple, where he accuses the money changers in the temple of turning it into a den of thieves through their commercial activities. Now, arguably, the money changers are there for the purpose of helping the Jews coming to the temple around Passover to participate in the mitzvah of Machzit HaShekel, of giving the half shekel to the temple itself. But according to the gospel account, Jesus was very upset by the fact that the money changers were turning this area of the temple into a commercial area. And so Jesus expels the money lenders into from the temple itself. One of the major events of the final days of Jesus' life is the betrayal of Judas Iscariot. Judas was one of Jesus' followers. He was one of the 12 original, what are called apostles of Jesus. He is known for betraying Jesus, of ratting Jesus out to members of the Jewish Sanhedrin for 30 coins. Judas is a tremendously controversial figure, but he is said, according to the gospel accounts, to have told the Sanhedrin, again the Jewish Sanhedrin, of the various quote-unquote miracles that Jesus had done, and the various teachings that he made. In turn, the Sanhedrin gives Judas 30 coins, 30 silver coins, and what this marks is the betrayal of Jesus, and really the beginning, or the process which leads to the crucifixion of Jesus. Jesus is said, according to Judas Iscariot, as considering himself to be a king, as considering himself to be the king of the Jews, as considering himself to be a holy person, something in which the Romans would have found very troublesome. This leads to one of the most famous and one of the most well-known parts and aspects of Jesus' life, and that is the Last Supper. The Last Supper is the final meal that Jesus shares with his apostles, with his students, his followers in Jerusalem before the crucifixion. The Last Supper, many historians will say, was Jesus' celebration of the Pesach Seder. Obviously, the Last Supper is memorialized in a number of works of arts. Obviously, the one you see in front of you right now is one of the most famous. The Last Supper is generally considered to be one of the last moments of Jesus' life, and the last opportunity that he has to engage with his followers. Jesus and Caiaphas, again, one of the last moments of Jesus' life. Caiaphas is involved in bringing charges against Jesus to the Jewish Sanhedrin. Caiaphas seems to have had a negative reaction to Jesus and comes to the Sanhedrin to give testimony of the quote-unquote miracles that Jesus had done to the Sanhedrin itself. Now, the Jewish Sanhedrin did not have the power to punish Jesus, and as such, they bring Jesus to the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate is the Roman governor in charge of the land of Israel. The Sanhedrin, the Jewish court, brings Jesus to Pontius Pilate, claiming that Jesus is saying he is the king of the Jews, saying that he is trying to usurp power from Rome. Throughout the various gospel accounts of Jesus and Pontius Pilate, it makes it out Pontius Pilate was actually trying to save Jesus from any possible punishment. According to the Gospels, though, Jesus doesn't really engage in trying to discuss with Pontius Pilate what exactly he's doing. When Pontius Pilate asks whether Jesus is the king of the Jews, Jesus doesn't actually respond. And According to the gospel accounts, Pontius Pilate lets the crowd surrounding him decide what to do with Jesus. And the crowd wants Jesus to be punished. According to the gospel, Pontius Pilate says, "I find no guilt in him, in Jesus." And it's up to the Jews surrounding him to punish Jesus. Again, he's being brought in front of Pontius Pilate, and he's being brought before Pontius Pilate to the Sanhedrin, being accused of claiming to be the king of the Jews, to be the savior of the Jews, to be the Messiah of the Jews. And these are the claims that are being put forward. Now, again, Pontius Pilate says, "I have no guilt in Jesus," and indicates that he wipes his hand clean, and it's to the Jews to decide what happens to Jesus. And their decision is that Jesus needs to be punished and needs to be punished for his crimes. And the punishment was, of course, crucifixion. The punishment for Jesus' claim to be the king of the Jews, again, the claim that the Jews are making, the claim, again, and this is what the gospel is saying, the claim that he is the Messiah, the punishment is crucifixion. The crucifixion is the death of Jesus. Jesus is said to have been crucified beginning on what is called Good Friday, and he, over the course or before the crucifixion, he has to endure various torments. The crucifixion lasts for some 6 hours, in which finally Jesus succumbs and he dies. The crucifixion takes place in the city of Jerusalem. Subsequently, there is a church built over the site where Jesus is said to have been crucified, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, which is located today in the Old City of Jerusalem. This is the actual shrine in which Jesus was killed and in which he was crucified. And finally, according to the various gospel accounts, on the third day after Jesus is crucified, so he's crucified on Friday, Saturday, and then Sunday, Jesus is resurrected. After he's crucified, he's put into a stone tomb, which is then covered. And then on the third day afterwards, a number of his followers come and look for his body in order to bury it in a final resting place, and the body is gone. And Jesus appears to his followers in a dream, telling his followers, specifically his followers, that he is being brought up by God, that he is being resurrected by God, and that he actually is not dead. The resurrection is the final act of Jesus's life. Again, Jesus, according to the gospel accounts, doesn't really die, but his physical body only is crucified. He himself is resurrected on the third day. These are the major aspects of Jesus' life, major narrative of Jesus' life. And it gives us a sense as to how the New Testament progresses, how the gospel progresses from the beginning of Jesus' life to the end. We'll be using this as a jumping off point to talk about the later aspects of the development of Christianity, really after Jesus is crucified. We'll be talking more about some of these aspects in class, but this will provide the basic knowledge, the basic narrative of the life of Jesus.